You're a joke. Mark, a man who spends his nights chasing fairy dust while his family pays the bills. Emily said loud enough that the coffee clinked in every chipped mug around the diner, and my daughter stared at the sugar packet as if it could explain me, and people at the counter turned like dogs hearing a bell. My name is Mark Turner. I'm 43, from Akron, Ohio, and I felt the air leave the room in the exact shape of that sentence. I tightened my grip on the blue enamel mug with the nick in its rim because it was the only thing I had the habit of holding on to, and because there was a scrap of paper folded into my wallet. A stupid, stubborn little receipt nobody would have believed mattered, that I had memorized the way men memorize phone numbers they barely use. Emily laughed, her voice sharp as a waitress's order pad slamming down. Susan and Robert Halley, her parents, smirked with the practiced cruelty of a family that wears success like armor. Hannah, 8, watching the way grown people eat each other in prose, blinked and dropped her syrup-soaked pancake back onto the plate as if she pulled it away the moment might unstick. "You told me you were buying dreams," Robert said, a comment he meant to be finally funny, and the room tasted like burnt diner coffee and the metallic hollowness of being seen wrong. I had come into that booth with a phone full of numbers blinking like fireflies, a stranger's bank alert telling me I had more zeros than I knew how to count, and every step toward that table had been an invitation to celebration. I had imagined Hannah's small face lit up, Emily's fingers finding mine in normal, ordinary glee, but the conversation opened like a trapdoor, and I fell into how they saw me: foolish, irresponsible, a man who misplaced his worth in digits on screens no decent person trusted. Someone snorted at the bar, a man named Pete who always paid for his coffee with exact change and a life smaller than he liked. Another patron, a woman in a police uniform, turned her head away as if to spare me the spectacle. I said nothing then because the only defense I had felt ridiculous against those smiles. I listened to the mockery as if it were a coat I could take off later when it stopped fitting. I let them pin those labels to me as if they had the right. Inside me, a dangerous calculus began to slow and settle. Humiliation is a clean edge you can either bleed out on or use to carve a future. Hope is a poor lantern if you never learn how to shade it. I thought and tasted the thought like copper before I swallowed it, because words were a kind of currency too, and I needed mine counted quietly. The blue mug, that chipped stubborn thing with a ring of darkness where coffee always soaked into the rim, had been my father's. He'd given it to me the year his knees went out and he'd started coming late to the diner where he fixed other men's radios. Emily used to joke that the mug smelled like old garages and missed chances. Now she held its mockery up like a mirror. In that moment I watched her hold up our life like a joke, and the thing that tightened inside me was not the urge to shout back, but the knowledge that there are storms you survive because you have already practiced silence. The scrap of paper in my wallet was a secret so small it looked like nothing when unfolded: an address, a code, a memorized string of nonsense that had once read like a child's scribble, and keeping it had felt goofy, the sort of obsessive clinging to a possibility that people call superstition. I had not told Emily I still checked the balance at 2 in the morning, sometimes when insomnia chewed the edges of me. I hadn't told her that the money that had once been an unpopular joke now sat in a place most people could not touch without a map. She stood to go, her coat snapping closed like a verdict, Hannah following like a shadow that hadn't yet learned to carry its own light, and Susan's eyes were bright and cruel like pennies polished to a flash. At the threshold, Emily turned and said with an accuracy that hurt, "I can't be married to a man who won't grow up," and the door closed behind them with the familiar finality of family doors. People at the counter resumed their breakfasts as if the economy of shame had been a menu item. The waitress gave me a sympathetic look I'd have refused on a better day, and I paid the bill with hands that didn't tremble enough for anyone to notice. I walked home through rain that smelled like the city rinsing itself, and the truck headlights cut through the wet like knives. I carried the blue mug in a plastic bag so it wouldn't clink against anything and reveal how much I loved it, because love for small things is always a vulnerable, ridiculous thing to other people. That night I opened my laptop in the dark, and I watched numbers move in ways they had not been meant to just last week. One little account that had once been a joke to my family had grown in the silence, and I realized how thin the line is between being laughed at and being unassailable. I thought of all the championships you never care about until you're old enough to understand they mark who you trusted. I slept with a hand over the folded scrap in my wallet, as if its presence could keep me anchored. If patience is a weapon, it's dull until tempered. I told myself, and the sentence was the kind of private law you make when you have decided to build rather than burn. The first days were small rebellions. I changed how I drank coffee, stopped taking the route that passed Emily's parents' house, turned away from the bar where Pete waved. I reclaimed a pocket of my life from their expectations and put it into practice. I cashed out quietly in pieces so nobody could point to a single day and say I had stolen anything. I diversified into things that didn't make good conversation in family rooms, into trusts with names that sounded like legal fog, into small businesses I knew how to make run lean. I closed accounts and opened new ones under names that would mean nothing to my past and everything to my future. I learned the ledger speech of finance the way a man learns to drive a new truck, by spending hours listening to the engine and the road. I rented an office downtown with a corner window that looked over the river, a place where I could tell myself I was making new furniture for a life that had been mocked. I called no one to brag. I whispered to a lawyer named Kevin Morales, who smelled like old paperbacks and who said very little but wrote the kind of contracts that build quiet empires. I drank coffee from the chipped blue mug every morning like a ritual to the man I used to be and the man I was becoming. The mug held both the smell of my father's hands and the implacable patience of something that endures small harms. Nights I lay awake mapping possibilities like constellations, putting names I wanted to see fall into positions where gravity would do the rest. I started small. An LLC here, a shell company there, a discreet purchase of a parcel 2 doors down from the restaurant the Hales loved to pretend was quaint. I made friends with accountants who asked the sort of questions people think sound boring and were actually how you undo people's lives without anyone knowing which knife did the work. At work, my boss, a woman named Teresa, who had been kind in the ways bosses can afford to be, congratulated me on my sudden professional energy and praised me for stepping up, not knowing that the change was not the brittle stepping up of ambition, but the measured gait of somebody who had been taught to move like a chess piece. In the weeks that followed Emily's leaving, she sent Hannah to visit, and Hannah arrived with small, anxious drawings and a heart shaped like a question mark. I folded them into a drawer and promised myself I wouldn't use them as bargaining chips. Instead, I bought Hannah a bicycle with a basket and a bell that rang bright and clear. I watched her pedal in the park on an afternoon that smelled like cut grass and felt like a loan of sunlight. I never told her why I bought it. I learned the economy of patience the way an old man learns to save his breath, by conserving everything that matters. A ledger doesn't lie. People do, I said once to myself, as if that were a prophecy, and the phrase felt true enough to carry into the business of remaking a life. People began to notice subtle changes. My car got a new inspection sticker. The suit I bought had broader shoulders more like armor than the slouchy clothes I'd favored when I felt less certain of myself. I took up running and memorized the rhythm of my feet. Running taught me how to measure distance and restitution in the same breath. I stopped going to the diner where Emily had left. Instead, I went to a different one across town where a waitress named Lori knew my order before I did because she listened in a way people who have been ignored for a long time learn to. I never gossiped about Emily or the Hales. Gossip is a currency that expends integrity, and I was richer for having less of it. Months arranged themselves like careful bricks, and I placed each one with a patience that did not show in the flash of headlines it would later cause. I bought a small stake, here and there, in the kinds of companies that seemed to feed my brother Jason's rise. Logistics firms, regional contractors, suppliers, to the kind of business he built a city around. I set up non-profit shells that paid reporters to look into patterns of contracts and a city hall that liked to give tax incentives to companies owned by men with good suits and private planes. I hired auditors that read past years for sins that add up quietly but whose totals make men uncomfortable on stage. At home, I fixed the things that gossip had taught a family to ignore. The leaky sink, the crooked stair, the bookshelf Hannah used as a fort. I kept the blue mug on the top shelf where dust gathered like testimony and where it stared at me when I came into the kitchen. I stopped answering the phone for numbers that started with the Hales exchange. When Hannah called, I made sure she knew I would come to her games and to school plays because actions, not vows, are what shape children. I did not enter into anything that looked like a spectacle. I learned that the most effective revenge is not fireworks but slow, calibrated daylight. Justice doesn't clap. It accumulates, I murmured into the dark some nights, a private sentence that braced me like a spine. The Hales' mockery had been a bright, public strike. My response was not to shout back, but to build the kind of quiet architecture that makes noise look flimsy. Jason, my younger brother, carried his success like rope around his chest, steady and confident and loved by newspapers who wrote profiles in glossy ink about the kid from Akron who made himself into an emblem. He dated well and married well and, more importantly for his brand, gave good interviews about hustle and the American dream. We had grown up on the same street, our father teaching us both the value of persistence, and now he wore persistence like a tuxedo. He called me sometimes, a text here and there, short deliveries of casual affection, but the emotional gulf between us was a thing professionals could swim through only if paid. I began to attend the same charity events in the city, but as a quiet donor, the kind that buys tables and does not put names on marquees. I sponsored after-school programs in neighborhoods he had once said deserved better than politicians could provide. People applauded him on panels for philanthropy, while I funded actual programs without the photograph on the front page. In the background, I had set my trap, contracts, anonymous complaints that tied curious threads into a rope. The world moved as it always did. A mixture of gossip, luck, and the slow turning wheel of accountability, and I let the wheel do its work. There were nights when the loneliness was a physical ache. There were windows where I would have given anything for Emily's presence beside me, for Hannah's hand in mine during a school performance. There were evenings when the blue mug caught my eye and I had to step away from the kitchen because the memory of the diner cut like glass. But every time I wanted to show the world that I had won by shouting, I remembered the table where she had said, "I was a joke," and I kept my voice in my pocket. The trap tightened because I had been patient. Little filings on the book of records that, when amassed, created a pattern. I paid people to follow the money in the way prosecutors do. I photographed invoices and stacked the paper like forensic evidence. I hired a young investigative reporter named Allison, who had a mouth like a match, small and lit, and she found the holes in the contracts that pointed toward a city hall official amenable to favors. Allison was hungry for truth, and we were allies in the same weather. To her this was not revenge, but reportage, and the world likes a neat narrative with a villain. I seeded a rumor here, a feuillet request there, and watched as pride performed the rest. Jason continued to speak about leadership and integrity, while his company's balance sheets suffered quietly from decisions he had made with the arrogance of certainty. He bought a new boat in a season that would later look obscene. He gave speeches about giving back and signed agreements without reading the footnotes. The Hales threw parties where they toasted to the kind of success that only photographs can hold. They posted smiling faces on social media with captions that insisted on happiness like a brand. Behind those smiles, I placed the small legal instruments that would unfold without spectacle. A subpoena landed in a contractor's mailbox, and another in a government official's inbox. Papers that had been frayed by ink and negligence were bound into a case Allison published. The story spread like gasoline over dry wood. I was careful. I never gave interviews. I never appeared at press conferences. I never let my name be connected publicly to the money that paid the digging. I had learned how to move in the world like a ghost that pays the undertaker. Quietly, but with intention. You don't have to be loud to be heard. Sometimes you just have to be right. I told myself, and the sentence felt less like comfort than like instruction. The city responded the way cities do when a pattern is finally recognized. Municipal investigations, auditors with clipboards, board meetings called in the middle of nights. Jason's company faced fines, contracts were paused, and his board shuffled in public like a chorus pretending to be surprised. The Hales tried to laugh it off at first, playing victim with the practiced charm of people who never expected to lose their footing. Emily called once, voice thin and formal, asking about Hannah in a way that hid the tremor in her sentences. I told her where Hannah's school recital would be and that I would be there. I did not mention the lawsuits or the anonymous donations or the fact that I had bought a small, symbolic parcel next to the restaurant they loved with money no one knew was mine. I kept the blue mug wrapped in paper in the top drawer of my desk as if it were evidence that someone could use to justify me, not in the court of public opinion, but in the private court that decides who we become. The months stacked, and then one morning the city paper ran a headline that made the blood in my veins quicken. Local contractor under federal investigation. City officials question. Jason's face, once bronze on glossy pages, looked paler in the paper's photograph. A smile that had once been easy now seemed forced. He posted a message about transparency and promised cooperation. His PR team coordinated interviews apologetic enough to placate shareholders but not the public. A man who had always expected reward for his swagger found that the world could remove applause and leave nothing beneath it. I watched from the margins as men with good suits began to look like men who had miscalculated. The Hales parties grew smaller and quieter as invitations dried up like the last puddles after a storm. The same faces turned their backs when events required seriousness. Hannah, who had once witnessed my humiliation like a teaching, came to my house for a visit, and she stayed longer than her mother expected. On the kitchen table, the blue mug sat like a quiet monument. At a school recital, I sat in the second row and watched her belt out a line as if the spotlight were a hand offering her a future. And when the audience clapped, she looked at me and grinned like a comet had just passed. The exposure grew until Jason's board asked him to step aside pending investigation, and he did, with the dignity of a man who still thinks his reputation will insulate him. He did not see the legal pressure as a noose until it tightened, and then he struggled like any man who has confused momentum from meaning. The fall was public. The resignation, the stock tumble, the late-night phone calls that did not go through to trusted friends. The Hales' laughter turned brittle and then silent. The people who had once smirked at me now felt the uncomfortable sensation of a floor that might move under them. They walked with a new slowness around the city's social centers. I did not savor this in any instant. That would feel cruel. I had no appetite for gloating, because the thing I wanted was not to watch them suffer, but to tilt the scales back toward something equitable. Yet justice has forms that look like spectacle on television and private ruin in municipal records, and watching the arc of consequence was an education in itself. I've never wanted to be the villain in someone else's story. I had wanted to be the man who proved that stubborn private work could translate into a life that refused to be mocked. When Jason's legal bills mounted and board members distanced themselves, his alliances frayed. Emily sent Hannah more often, perhaps because the home she had once chosen felt smaller, now that the social currency she had traded on was becoming a liability. The blue mug became a talisman I kept near the ledger of my life, a reminder that small things survive ridicule and eventually mean something. I had arranged, through lawyers and trustees, to buy the parcel of land next to the diner in a quiet auction, a transaction no one would connect to me because the holding company had a name that meant nothing and everything. The legal filings were dry and bureaucratic, but the effect would be sharp. Once owned, the land could host a new project that would reconfigure the neighborhood's loyalties. I planned a community center named for my father, a place where kids could get tutoring and free hot coffee without the sizzle of status. I imagined Hannah walking through its doors and not seeing the kinds of people who measure others by their jokes. The parcel purchase was symbolic, yes, but so is much of what people call revenge. Symbolism has teeth if you know how to bite. Power is not always loud. Sometimes power is the quiet that rearranges the room. I muttered into a late-night phone call with Kevin Morales, and he laughed softly because he understood the language of invisible scaffolding. The legal inquiries deepened, and one morning Allison's piece dropped like a brick in a pond and the ripples hit every shore. Evidence of misallocated city contracts, a web of favors, a culture of entitlement. Jason's name was on every list, and people who had once smiled for photos with him now gave statements about due diligence and fiduciary responsibility. I watched from a bench in the park as his life unstitched itself in measured, legal motions. There were moments when I wondered if I had become what I had despised, a man who wielded money like a club. And then Hannah would laugh and I would remember that my work had always been beneath the veneer of vengeance, the reconstruction of what family means. The Hales calls stopped coming to my number. Susan sent a perfunctory note through a neighbor asking after Hannah's grade reports. I replied with the facts because I had learned the art of distance. At the annual charity gala where Jason had once been the centerpiece, I sat near the back with a suit that fit like armor and watched him give a speech about resilience that tasted faintly of apology. He did not name me. There was no need. Public ruins do not always require a naming. The board voted, the contracts were renegotiated, and in the end, Jason found himself owning a smaller company with fewer friends. The city's perception of him shifted from inevitable success to cautionary tale. The final act, the one that would become the headline people repeated in bars and by water coolers, came because of a single document Allison had dug up and published. A chain of emails tying a favored contractor to a city official and to a backup account with payments that did not match services. The investigation widened, and men who had built their lives on charm and a certain casual deceit found themselves answering to auditors. It was in the fallout that the poetic justice I had engineered, painfully, patiently, manifested. Jason sold off assets to pay legal fees. His house took on the quality of a place whose photographs no longer matched the story they tried to tell. Emily, watching the world change on her phone, called me one evening and said Hannah needed new shoes and she couldn't cover the cost this month. I wired the money without commentary, and Hannah thanked me by drawing a small sun and taping it to my fridge. The city council awarded contracts to other firms whose bids were cleaner, and the social calendar shifted. A group that had once been untouchable now found itself outside the tent. In a final public motion that felt like a line drawn under a paragraph, the community center I had built on the parcel, Turner Commons, named quietly for the man whose coffee mug had weathered family ridicule, opened with a ribbon cutting that featured smiling children and an oversized coffee urn that smelled like the blue mug and my father's hands. I had arranged for a plaque to be installed in the lobby that read nothing about vengeance but everything about purpose, and in one small private flourish I placed the chipped blue enamel mug inside a display case with a note that said, simply, "For keeping faith." When the Hales came to see the center, invited by neighbors and bewildered by the warmth that did not require their input, they found their old mockery turned into something useful. Jason stood in the crowd, smaller in stature to my eye than he had used to be, and when he looked at the mug he saw not a joke but a story he had once refused to believe. The legal consequences had already taken their course. He paid fines, he apologized in the paper, and his pride was a debt he could not reverse. Emily and I spoke once in the lobby as children ran past, sticky with ice juice. She said quietly, "I didn't know," as if ignorance were a defense or confession. I answered, "Neither did you," because she hadn't known and because she had left and come back only when the weather of our lives changed. Hannah ran a small hand along the glass of the mug's case and said, "It's pretty," and I felt an ache like a bruise and a strange relief that the thing that had been a symbol of mockery had become part of something that would feed other people's mornings. In court filings and in civic meetings, Jason's name receded from the marquee to the footnote. His empire had been pruned by facts, and by a city that would no longer tolerate the sloppy mixing of public service and private enrichment. The Hales lost invitations and privilege, and for a time, the easy smiles that had made them comfortable. I did not arrange for them to be ruined in the gutters. I arranged for accountability and for structures that would not let the same patterns recur. They were left to reckon, to rebuild, or to recede, and there is a cruelty in watching people meet the consequences of choices you once tolerated. In the quiet after the headlines faded, I sold the last of the holding companies that had been a means to an end, and we used the money from those sales to endow Turner Commons Scholarship Fund. Allison got a Pulitzer, and we kept the checks anonymous. She called once and left a message saying, "You did good work," and I listened to it 3 times. Hannah finished 2nd grade with a trophy for a spelling bee, and she tucked it into the shelf next to the display case that held the blue mug, a small constellation of trophies that did not belong to a social calendar but to a child's life. Jason's name still appears occasionally in articles about cautionary success stories, and I have seen him on the street looking smaller, as men who lose the narrative of invincibility often do. He nods sometimes and I nod back. There is a recognition there that is not affection and not animosity, more like an acknowledgement that our stories have diverged into different kinds of truth. I walk past the diner sometimes on a slow evening and Lori waves. She keeps a saucer there for me and the blue mug sits in its case, but the scent of coffee lingers in the building like a memory. People approach me at Turner Commons and tell me their stories and ask about funding and jobs, and I sign the papers and say, "We'll see what we can do," because hope, when you have it, is best spent on the small, durable things. There are nights the old wound opens, and I think of Emily's voice in that diner, and how quickly people can make a man into a punchline. There are afternoons when Hannah runs past and looks back to wave. I am not whole, you cannot rebuild without some scars, but I carry a quieter wisdom now that does not need other people to name it. The final lesson is plain. Patience converted into work breeds a kind of justice that looks like rebuilding, and no matter how clever the sneer, the economy of real change is slow and unflashy. Life taught me one last thing in 2 sentences. Dignity is quieter than revenge, and the man who learns to build instead of break keeps more than money. He keeps himself. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.